Everyone? Okay. All right, so before I start with the narrative, I'm just going to explain the map that we all handed out to you, and just to orient everyone as to where we are. I don't know if you're from Newton or Newton Center or not. So, we are right here, the corner of Grant and Com Ave. Here's Grant, here's Com Ave, and we're going to be walking up Montvale, through Montvale Crescent, down here, then down Bishopsgate, and then through here, which is not on the map because it was developed later and separately, but we'll talk about that when we get there. But so yeah, if you're confused as to where we are, just reference the maps that we handed out to you. In the meantime, while I'm talking, I'm just gonna hand this around to everyone, or you can pass it around just to sort of get a better sense of the neighborhood and the original plan. And this was the original subdivision plan, which was drafted by Olmsted, and Elliott in 1894. And Frederick Law Olmsted was technically part of the firm at that point, but he did retire in 1895. So he probably wouldn't have been intimately involved in this project, but he would have been aware of it, and I'm sure he would have approved of it before they finalized it. So I'll start over here if you'd like to start taking a look at that. Okay. So I thought a good way to start this would just be a brief overview of Newton history and transportation history for people who aren't necessarily familiar with it. So Newton was settled in the late 1630s as part of Cambridge, and it was originally called Cambridge Village until the late 17th century. So, there we go. So yeah, for the first 200 years or so, Newton was relatively quiet. It grew very slowly. It was an agricultural community. It was largely associated with the market at Boston. That's where they shipped their goods. And then beginning in 1834, the Boston-Worcester Railroad came through, first arriving at West Newton. And regular commuter service began in the 1840s, which allowed connections to Boston, allowed commuters to live in Newton and then commute into Boston. And just to give you a sense of the impact that the railroad and the commuters had on the population of the city, in 1830, before the railroad started coming through, the population of Newton was 2,376, and by 1900, the population was 33,587. In the 1840s, the 1850s, and the 1860s, the growth rate in Newton was above 50%. So each decade, the population was growing over 50%. So that just gives you some sense of the impact that commuting and the railroads had on the development of Newton.
Good plug for public transportation.
Exactly. So, just to give you a sense of sort of how the railroads grew and developed. The first line was in the north part between Newton Corner and West Newton approximately. And then in the south part was sort of what we know as the D line today, the D branch of the Green Line, from Newton Center originally to Newton Highlands, and then it kind of curved down into Needham. And that was called the Charles River Railroad. And for about 20 years, that was used, for the most part, to bring the gravel from Needham to the Back Bay project for the landfill. And after that, after the 1870s really, is when regular commuter service started. So this brings us to the era that we're talking about today, sort of the late 19th century. By the 1880s, Newton villages were well served by streetcar lines connecting the individual villages as well as surrounding towns, in addition to the railroads. However, these were largely on the northern and southern, not so much extremities, but parts of the city. And sort of this broad swath in the middle where Com Ave goes through was largely undeveloped. So, in the early 1890s, a group of landowners in this area, calling themselves the Boulevard Syndicate, formed. And these were private citizens and landholders, including Albert D.S. Bell, Judge Robert R. Bishop, and Dana Estes. And they approached the city with a proposal for a boulevard extending from the Brighton line to Center Street through their land holdings. And in response to this, the city established a boulevard commission, established December 12, 1892, to discuss new routes through the city to better connect to Boston and open it for development. In 1893, the Boulevard Commission approved a suggestion for the Newton Boulevard, with a streetcar line along the middle, flanked by the main road, which is right there, and then the carriage road, which is one lane, which is here. And of course, the streetcar used to run down the middle here. So if you can imagine, streetcars. So, upon approval of the Boulevard plan, the Boulevard Syndicate began acquiring additional land in Path Boulevard, they bought from the Ward and Johnson families. And the Wards owned pretty much all this, and a good amount on this side. But the syndicate bought it up, knowing that the boulevard would come through and increase the property values and the potential for subdivision, which we're going to see in a few minutes. The syndicate offered to donate land and 1/3 the cost of construction, which may seem very generous, but it was largely out of self-interest. I mean, they knew that the boulevard coming through would increase the potential for profit and subdivision, which is exactly what they did. The construction on the Chestnut Hill leg, which began right next to the reservoir and goes past here, began on May 30th, 1894. The boulevard was laid out by city engineer Albert F. Noyes. The construction was overseen by Superintendent of Streets Charles W. Ross. And they tried to design it according to the principles of Frederick Law Olmsted, including winding route, wide open spaces, and plenty of vegetation. And further beyond Center Street, there was a sister syndicate called the Park Land Syndicate, which developed lands further west, which we're not going to talk about today. But the boulevard was developed in 4 separate sections. This first one originally extended to Center Street, and it stopped. And then beyond that, it went from Center Street to Walnut. That was the second. Walnut to Washington Street, and then from there to the Newton-Weston border, and that was the final section. And all the work on the boulevard was completed in late 1895. We'll talk about that. Okay, so the map that you have, the original subdivision, was approved in 1894, drafted by Olmsted and Elliott. And as I said, Frederick Law Olmsted was still at the firm, but he probably wouldn't have been intimately involved in the project. The principals in the firm were John Charles Olmsted, who was sequentially the nephew and then the stepson of Frederick Law Olmsted, and then Frederick Law Olmsted's son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and Charles Elliott. And as I said, Frederick Law Olmsted retired in 1895. Okay, so the Hobart Estate, which is kind of what I've christened the neighborhood, I haven't seen an official name for it, so that's just what I called it for today. It's a prime example of late Victorian suburban residential subdivision. It's indicative of the Olmsted firm's design philosophy, adhering to natural topography, curving streets, an emphasis on greenery, and maintenance of a natural feeling. And it's unique in its history. It's unique in that its history and development is intertwined, both literally and figuratively, with that of the Newton Boulevard / ComAv. It was developed as housing for new urban commuter professionals, men who would work in Boston and were able to utilize the new streetcar line on the boulevard, as well as the regular railroads to the south and to the north. The first houses were completed right around 1894, developed incrementally, mostly built out by the 1930s. And today we're going to see a range of architectural styles ranging from the country seat colonial style of the original Bishop Estate to the post-war international style. Alright, so we're going to start heading that way to Montvale Street. And I just want you to keep in mind that this was the very first section of the subdivision to be developed. It's pretty much all 1890s, so just keep that in mind as we start heading through. So behind me is 97 Montvale. And this is most likely the first house that was built as part of the new subdivision. The plans were drawn up for the property itself, completed September 13th, 1893. So before they'd actually approved the final plan for the subdivision, which indicates to me that they were supremely confident that the city was going to approve the plan as they proposed. And so yeah, the house itself was completed August 7th, 1894 for Minnie Helen Crowell. And I don't have much details about the architecture, but it's more or less vernacular colonial revival, very typical of Newton for the 1890s. And it's, yeah, kind of the very first example that we have of the new neighborhood. Here we have 77 Montvale. It's 2.5-story colonial revival again. It has a semicircular portico topped by a turned balustrade, which extends to each side to form a veranda across the front of the house. A gambrel roof and slate flares at the eaves, and has a complete returns in the gable ends. Flared. What's that?
What did you say about the ends?
It has
Yeah, what does
a
that
gambrel
mean?
roof of slate flares at the eaves, and has complete returns in the gable ends.
What does that mean?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not, this is just from our house files, so I'm going with
When was this built?
This was built, we don't have a date, but I'm guessing probably right around 1897, 1898. Let's see, where was I? Flared hip dormers flank a polygonal dormer on the south facade, which is the one facing us. That's referring to just the way the roof flares out. All right, so now we're going to head up Montvale Crescent. And this is probably one of the first examples you see of the way in which they laid out the streets to mirror the topography that existed before, as opposed to kind of leveling or demolishing what was already there naturally. Okay, so here we have 61 Montvale Crescent as opposed to Montvale Road. It's built around 1899, probably for Alice and Joseph Work. Joseph Work was a treasurer in Boston who again commuted to his job in the city. The architects were Kendall and Taylor, and alterations and interior changes were done by Coolidge and Carlson, and that name will come up later in the tour, so keep it in mind. Its prairie-style antecedents are clear from the boxy but horizontal shape to the wide eaves overhanging from the house and its porch, decorated with a Frank Lloyd Wright type geometric latticework. You can see sort of, I guess, on either side of the main entrance. The latticework in a different pattern is repeated under a stepped pergola-style fence on the western side of the house. Oh, yeah, you can see it, yep, over there. Gambled roof has pent roof returns and 4 pent roof gamble dormers. Okay, so to our right is 51 Montvale Crescent. It was completed by 1907 for Edna and Alan Hubbard. This large 2.5-story house is colonial revival in style, but looks for its antecedents not to New England's colonial past, but to Tidewater, Virginia, and Bacon's Castle, which is a great 17th century brick mansion-style house down in Virginia. On its south facade, a gambled pavilion projects, which has Baroque scrolled consoles in Jacobean fashion flanking the gable. A red tile roof and stucco walls are modern-day adaptations of the original in brick and Rational Revival elements, such as the geometric bay window on the south facade, which is facing us, and the broad tile-roofed entrance porch on piers appears. It's kind of an interesting melding of styles. Okay, so now, all right, so behind me is 54 Montvale Road. It was built right around 1896 for Howard Emerson, who was a salesman in Boston. It's a colonial revival house, which follows a common pattern in Newton. A gambrel roof inserted by a transverse gambrel gable. It has a shed roof and hipped dormers asymmetrically placed on the roof. And shallow column supported porch extends from the cross gable. I'm wondering if we should even... So, for the next house, I don't think we even have to move, because it is right behind you. And we can probably get a better look of it as we walk down to the next part. Okay, so behind us is 41 Montvale. This is the Frank H. Stewart house, who was a lawyer in Boston. Again, these guys all worked in Boston. Built around 1909, and the family lived in the house until the 1940s. The architect was Herbert Lucas of New York. And the Frank H. Stewart house is one of several well-designed classical revival style estates in Newton. It is a large 2-story stucco-clad house enclosed by green tile hip roof with exposed rafter ends and 3 hipped dormers across the front slope. The facade features a long 1-story porch, which also has a green tile roof. Incorporated at the end of the porch are glazed polygonal bays. Centered beneath the porch is an entry framed by side lights. 2-story wings fronted by 1-story porches extend from both side elevations. Okay, so we can probably start walking down and then we'll try and get a better look as we... Around 1907 in the colonial revival style. It's a broad 5-bay house, which refers to the number of windows. Widely overhanging eaves decorated with thin strips that can either be seen as conical revival modillion blocks or as rational revival exposed purlins. And that just goes right over my head. A column-supported portico in front of an entry with fanlight and leaded side lights is clearly colonial revival, but the triple window on the second floor, flaring hipped roof dormers, are rational revival and make this house an interesting combination of styles. And right off the bat, you've got This is number 19, I think, and then number 30. And you can tell they're teens, 20s, Colonial Revival brick style. So immediately we're starting to see the change. And for the most part, this area was developed later than Montvale. And Montvale was the original street. So I just want you to keep in mind as we head down Bishopsgate, the topography and sort of the way in which they bend the streets around the natural features. And primarily you can see here, this is a natural stone outcropping that really forms the heart of the neighborhood. And they deliberately laid streets out on either side. Here we've got Bishopsgate on this side, and on the other side is Hobart. So just keep that in mind as we start walking down there. Very typical 1920s Newton Tudor style. And if you go through the Ward School neighborhood, that's basically all that this is. And that should scream 1920s to you whenever you see Newton Tudor style. But I wanted to stop here primarily for this house on the other side. This is pure 1930s. This French style was very popular in Newton, and especially in Wellesley. If you go through Wellesley Hills, this style was very popular. It was built in around 1935 by Dr. David B. Stearns, who was a physician, who worked in Brookline. And again, this French Provençal whitewashed, variegated, multicolored brick style with the curved entry portico. It's very French country style. And I mean, I wanted to point it out because it shows the transition from Montvale, sort of the older neighborhood, to what came decades later. All right, so we're gonna continue down Bishopsgate for a little bit.
Excuse me, what made that?
For and by Henry J. Carlson, who is an architect with Coolidge and Carlson. And if you remember, I told you to keep that name in mind from the remodeling up on Montvale. So he actually lived in the neighborhood. It's an interesting mixture of colonial revival motifs. First of all, from Tidewater, Virginia, colonial, comes the parapet and walls, which are called Bacon's Castle, again. Yet the house also has a brick end wall on the east, which you saw, and repeats the New England colonial brick-ender style. Finally, it has a tile roof with large spherical finials, which you can see prominently at the corners of the roof, and a stucco exterior, which was taken from the Spanish colonial styles of the southwestern United States. So again, you've got this really eclectic melding of styles. All right, so we're going to...
When was this one built?
1901, right around 1901.
Why do you think there was so much eclecticism?
That's a good question.
It seems more prevalent here than less Newton Hill.
He asked, why does there seem to be so much more eclectic architecture here as opposed to West Newton Hill, for example? That's a very good question, and that's something I could look into. I mean, most of the architectural write-ups are from our house files, because I didn't actually do the research.
Okay.
But that's a very good question. I mean, for this guy, he was an architect and he lived in the neighborhood, so he clearly had his own stamp that he put on this house and the other one up on Montvale Crescent that he did. So that explains those two.
And who was it who built this?
This was Henry J. Carlson of Coolidge and Carlson, the architectural firm. All right, so we're going to start heading down there, and then I think we're going to take the left right onto Ledges, and then we'll stop at the bottom of the Ledges and then have a little talk. This is the Ledges Road, and it's named after the ledges, fittingly enough, that front and slope down onto Beacon Street. If you drive on Beacon Street, you can see it's this dramatic rock formation. That was, the street was named after those. And so, if you've been following on your maps that we handed out, this little area isn't on the original subdivision plan. And that's because in 1894, this was still all owned by R.R. Bishop, Judge R.R. Bishop, who lived at the end. And I don't think he was initially planning on selling off as much as he did. But once he saw the success and the profitability of the rest of the neighborhood, I think he decided to subdivide a bunch of his land. So that's where we are now. And the first house right here is number 10. And this is the second James Ritchie house. It's a Tudor Revival structure, perched on a lofty and craggy site. It's a two-story gable roof house whose first story is clad in brick that is sometimes laid in a herringbone pattern and is sometimes half-timbered. The upper story is stuccoed and includes numerous cross gables. One cross gable on the rear elevation has a large bank of windows. A garage is incorporated beneath the house, as is common with houses on hilly lots. And there's a big write-up on, he had an architectural practice, but I'm just going to read some of the buildings that they designed so you get a sense. They did 10 Collins Road in Waban, which is a house. I don't know if you recognize it. It was followed by the residence for J. Earl Parker at 27 Matacomet Road in Waban as well. They also did the Charles River Country Club at 45 Dedham Street in Oak Hill. The Woodland Golf Club at 1897 Washington Street. Newton Center Branch Library, which is no longer used as a library. The Newton Trust, now Bay Bank. This is kind of old. In West Newton at 1 Chestnut Street, which is now, it's a Sovereign. The Ward School at 10 Dolphin Road, which is where I went to elementary school. And the police station and courthouse at 1321 and 1309 Washington Street in West Newton. And they also did the Auburndale Fire Station, which stood on Auburn Street, which has since been demolished. So we've got another architect design house here. All right, so we're gonna head up a little bit, and the next house is right here on the right. All right, this is the Edward P. Boson House. It's a 2.5-story brick Flemish bond structure enclosed by a slate gable roof with modillion cornice. The symmetrical facade is centered on an entry with side lights and a flat roof porch with iron balustrade. Glazed windows of the same width as the entry are located above. Flanking the entry are bay windows with 2 single windows above. Wings extend from both sides, and a glazed porch is located on the rear elevation. And there's some info about Edward P. Boson, but it's too hot, so. Yeah, but if, just as a side note, if you look behind you, you can see, these great rock formations that the neighborhood was named after. Very cool. And yeah, we're gonna move on to the next house now. And this is the Meyer House, and it's one of only a handful of international style houses in Newton. There are 2 other examples on Drumlin Road in Oak Hill. This is a 2-story stone structure featuring the cubic massing, unadorned wall surfaces, and strip windows. Typical. A smaller setback 3rd story rises from the flat roof of the main structure. And if you actually want to see more photos of this house is for sale. So if you go on the... a lot. I think it's 4.3. So yeah, if you want to see interior photos and better photos of the house itself.
This is called the International House, you said?
Yeah, and some of I've seen write-ups that attribute this to Walter Gropius. I've seen no justification for it. I think that's just a real estate embellishment. House, and of course he used to own probably, I'd say, 40 acres in the neighborhood. And the original house was built right around 1861, and so he was, he was very prominent in the community, and I'm convinced that his involvement in the Boulevard Syndicate was really kind of the push it needed to get it through the city government. Let's see, I've got info on him here somewhere. Okay. Robert R. Bishop served Newton long and well as a member of the Water Commission, which modernized the new city's system with the Wobbin Hill Reservoir in 1876, as representative to the General Court of Massachusetts, as president of the Mass Senate, and as a judge, and he died in 1909. Just an interesting little tidbit, I forget which aqueduct it is, but one of the aqueducts runs pretty much right parallel to this neighborhood, parallel to Beacon Street.
It's the Sudbury Aqueduct, and it's in a rock tunnel, so you can't.
Yep. So, yeah, that's that. And originally, this wasn't on the original map, if you look on the map that we handed out, but he did sell off parcels later. And if you actually look on the back of the handouts that we gave you, there's the map on the original subdivision map on one side, then on the other side is a series of pictures showing the evolution of this house and the different styles and the remodels and stuff.
Oh, they're all the same house? Oh, they're all
Yep.
the same house?
Yeah, it's the same house, and it was remodeled several times. So this is kind of the original estate house in the neighborhood. We're now headed into sort of a new phase of the same neighborhood, and the reason I consider it just an extension of it is that this was, again, still part of the Bishop estate originally, And this was broken off and subdivided in the 1880s, so before any talk of the boulevard. And this, I'm assuming, was more associated with the commuter service at Newton Center, as opposed to the streetcar or anything. So these were now in the 1880s as opposed to the 1890s or anything later than that. And this is Great Cliff Road, by the way. And the Great Cliff Historic District is a cohesive cluster of late 19th century residences, including some of the city's most notable examples of the shingle style. And here we've got number 39 Great Cliff. And it was built right around 1897 in a shingle style, modest proportions. Built into an embankment, the rear of the structure overlooks a rocky ravine. The steep gable roof is broken by a gambrel gable. The facade is enlivened by the overhang of the attic story and the small oriel window in the second story. In 1907, the owner of the house was Henry Tyler, a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So the house behind me is number 53 Great Cliff. It was built in the 1880s and is considered to be one of the city's finest examples of the shingle style. The contoured window and framements affirm the flexibility of shingle construction, and broad areas of roof emerge in accordion-like stages. Most of the exterior surfaces are clad in shingles, including the consoles supporting the overhang of the second and attic stories and the cornices. Yeah, very pure shingle style house. And then we're just gonna turn around, nice and easy. This is number 54. The house at number 54 Great Cliff, circa 1894, was the home of John Mainland, the Boston builder. The house exhibits the typical inventiveness with which colonial revival designers employed classical decorative motifs. The 2 and 1/2 story residences are based on a rectangular plan with a shallow gable entrance pavilion. The entrance has leaded glass side lights and is set within an ionic columned porch. All right. But I do just want to point out, on the way to Com Ave, if you look closely on your right, you'll see one of the original estate houses that predated the subdivision, and that was actually owned by the Claflin family, as in Governor Claflin, who was governor in the 1870s, I think.
What's the address?
So it's addressed as Grant, but it's so far, it's set way back.
And what's the number?
I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, we'll see. Okay.
But yeah, just I'll point it out, and you can keep your eye up here. Well, for those who would like an impromptu addition to the tour, I decided it might be cool to go see the old Claflin estate. So for those who would like to trudge up the hill and then come back down, you can come follow me. Yeah. So I don't have any notes or anything on this house, but I do know that it was built by the Claflins, and it was lived in by Agnes Claflin, who was either the daughter or the sister-in-law of the governor. And this is one of their properties. And then this is owned by an in-law of the Claflins as well, so it's kind of a family estate compound. And it's, going with the eclectic theme, it's got all sorts of combined design features. And again, just sort of one of the pre-subdivision estate properties that I thought might be interesting to tack on to the end. So yeah, that's the Claflin estate, which is now private property.
Where does the word commuter come from?
Oh yeah, I think this might have been a Boston area coinage, but for those who are just commuting, as we use it today, to the city for the day for work and then coming back, they would have a commuted rate on the train because they would only be bringing a suitcase or not the full luggage, so they would enjoy reduced fares, commuted fares, because they were only